good morning, Greater Purpose. Today we talked about holiness and what that meant for the ancient Israelite. And for them, holiness wasn't just about refraining from certain foods or activities. For them, holiness meant imitating their God. And who was their God? Was God just this love and just deity? No. For them, God was the manifestation of love and justice itself. And the call from the ancient Israelite priest was to replicate those attributes in the community's life. And that is a message that is powerful. It is needed today, no matter what faith you are. And this song talks about the importance of not just believing in a God that is holy, a God that is love, a God that is just, but wholly devoting oneself to manifesting those attributes in our society. Hope you enjoy it. I am full of earth, you are heaven's worth. I am stained with dirt, prone to depravity. You are everything that is bright and clean, and you're covering me with your majesty. But a certain sign of grace is this: the broken earth, flowers come up, pushing through the dirt. You are holy, holy, holy. All heaven cries, holy, holy God. And you are holy, holy, holy. I wanna be holy like you are. You are everything that is bright and clean, the antonym of me. You are divinity, and the truest sign of grace was this: wounded hands, justice falls down, liberating men. You are holy, holy, holy. All heaven cries, holy, holy God. And you are holy, holy, holy. I wanna be holy like you are. But the harder I try, the more clearly can I feel the depth of our fall and the weight of it all. And so this love could be the most impossible thing. Your grandness in me, making me clay. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. You are holy, holy, holy. All heaven cries, holy, holy God. So here I am, all of me, finally, everything holy, holy, holy. And I am holy, holy, holy. Oh, I am holy, 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 yours. Love, I am wholly yours. Grace and peace, y'all.
Hi everyone, this is Maria. I am a queer Mexican woman who uses they them pronouns and a poet, in case you didn't know. So this week I've chosen to read one of my original works that I wrote recently. and it's titled Rooted. The youth of a boy shoved under his bed reflected infinite times back, cosmic galaxies. The nothingness that fills, time-space overflows, stifling silence savored, space for emptiness, the sacred undone, reality and God simultaneously an impossibility.
Happy Sunday, Greater Purpose. It is so good to be with you this morning. You are welcomed, you are affirmed, and you are loved at this table that is set for kindred shakers of empire, the fiercely hospitable and devout arbiters of light and goodwill toward our fellow human beings. A couple of announcements before we move into the sermon. In the description of this live video today, you're only going to see the Zoom room number. Now, why is that? What happened to the YouTube? Well, we don't have a YouTube today. We have everything in one video. We'll get more about that in just a minute. Also, we're not collecting tithes. We ask that if you have a need to please post that need and your Venmo ID, if you're willing, in the comment section for the other members of the church to see. And we ask, church, that if you have excess, if you have abundance right now that you're willing to share with people that are in need during this time of crisis, please consider donating to those in need. We would much rather you give to people that are struggling right now than worry about donating to the church. Get you a grain product to set it to the side. Also get you some wine or get you some juice, set it to the side, and we are going to have communion at the end of the sermon together. Also, very, very important, get you an adult beverage to enjoy. I'm doing my typical bourbon thing. Get you one as well. This is not a dry church. This is a PG-13 church. Put your feet up and just relax and enjoy the sermon today. Also, stick around after the sermon because we're going to have the poetry, we're going to have the music, we're going to have the dance right after the sermon is over right here. So now we don't have to do a separate YouTube video for the arts portion of our service, and that is all thanks to Roman. Hats off to you, sir. Finally, please do us a favor and start a Facebook watch party if you're willing. That's going to generate more views to our fan base. The Facebook algorithms will actually prioritize that on people that follow the church's page. And it might also be encouraging for people in your circle of influence to see a church that stands for social justice and for once embraces science and that is on the right side of history, which is unusual for the modern church in general. Now today, as we move into the sermon, I got to tell you, we're going to talk about something that we almost skipped over entirely. Today, we're going to talk about something that I typically don't like teaching at all. Now, if you recall, a few weeks ago, I told you that my two least favorite books in the Bible are Leviticus and Numbers. I mentioned that. Dude, just snooze fest. So when I was studying the Hebrew Bible course from Yale, and I was kind of preparing how we were going to move through this study, I kind of skipped over the Leviticus part because I've never had a sermon or a series where it just didn't bore me to tears. And I arrogantly assumed that this section of Yale's curriculum wouldn't be any different concerning the priestly documents and that it would be boring as well. But this week, when I was thinking about writing the sermon, I was like, oh gosh, you know what? This has to be bigger than my own preferences and my own biases. So I sucked it up and I started watching this course on Leviticus and the priestly text. And I have never been happier to have been proven wrong in my life. Y'all, I gotta raise my glass. We're gonna raise glasses a few times today, but for now, we're gonna raise it to Professor Hayes because she actually made studying Leviticus interesting and fun. So cheers to you, Professor Hayes. Because of Professor Christine Hayes, I have this newfound appreciation for the cultural significance of Levitical law in the priestly text that I never knew was even possible at any point in my career. So again, I'm just so excited to teach y'all about that. But I wonder why I had this negative impression of Leviticus. And I still am trying to wrestle with why it was that I just never enjoyed it. And I think that it's because though this knowledge from Professor Hayes makes the text way cooler than I assumed it was before, it is still kind of a slow and tedious read, even though now I appreciate it a lot more. And secondly, because my own deep-seated toxicity probably tainted the view that I had of Leviticus. It's always hard to admit that you're a flawed person, but my internal biases probably had something to do with my judgment against Leviticus. You see, because of the anti-Semitic nature of many Christian theological perspectives, and again, I'm not proud of this, but I do come from a conservative evangelical background. But because of these anti-Semitic views that are kind of diet anti-Semitism that are injected into their sermons, I always just kind of assumed that these rituals in the Hebrew Bible, the regulations and sacrifices depicted in the priestly text and Levitical sections of the Torah were archaic. Because these texts were presented to me as a lesser form of positive spirituality. And I thought they were filled with practices of controlled savagery, if you will, that are perceived by me and other evangelicals of that time, and today even in conservative circles. They think that they're less valuable than the rituals and the worship practices and the symbolism found in the New Testament. So they're often taught as lesser text compared to New Testament verses. And my God, were my assumptions about Leviticus wrong? Were my teachers ever wrong? This is an incredibly interesting text. There's this wellspring of rich anthropological depth in the book of Leviticus. And though I assumed that Levitical law was void of such beauty because of its lack of narrative, I happily confess that I was mistaken. So what we're going to discuss today is amazing, and I cannot wait to share it with you all. So let's get after it. So Leviticus and Numbers have large blocks of mostly priestly materials. And what I mean by priestly materials is that they are from a priestly source, the priestly source actually, and that these blocks of text are specifically instructive in regards to how to worship the ancient Israelite God. It has instructions for sanctum and symbolism, rituals, sacrifices, and theology in regards to what was considered to be pure and profane and holy in that culture of ancient Israel. Now, there's a clear structure that I never saw before in regards to the format of Leviticus. Again, went unnoticed by me for a great deal of my career. Chapters 1 through 7 have to do with sacrificial practices. Chapters 8 through 10 have to do with the installation of Aaron. Aaron was Moses' brother, and it has to do with the installation of him as the high priest, and also it tells of his descendants, known as the Aaronites, that would be classified as the priestly clan. Chapters 11 through 15 have to do with ancient Israel's dietary restrictions. Fun. And chapter 16 on has to do with the Israelite annual celebration, 16 through 25 has to do with the Israelite annual celebration of atonement and the ritual instruction around this event that you may have heard of before. It's called Yom Kippur. And chapters 17 through 26 is known as the Holiness Code, and this section emphasizes the designations for what is considered to be holy in the realm of what is both behavioral and substance. This book is full of these priestly materials specific to how worship and communal rituals would and should be performed in the sanctum of the ancient Israelites. Now, the sanctum, this temple, would be known as the tabernacle. We talked about it a little bit last week. And the tabernacle was a tent-like structure that traveled with the ancient Israelites while they were nomads during the age that scholars call the wilderness period. Now, this house of worship, also known as a mishkan, was where ancient Near Eastern societies believed that their god and or gods, depending on what culture we're talking about, dwelled, where their gods or god resided. And in it, for the ancient Israelites, and these other ancient Near Eastern cultures, were relics used to perform rituals, and it's where they did sacrifices in an attempt to appease and to commune with their divine deities. Now, the tabernacle was divided internally into 3 different portions, okay? The first section was a courtyard with a sacrificial altar that was accessible to all of Israel's people. Further in, as you progress through the tabernacle, there was a screen that functioned as kind of a barrier to the sanctuary proper, through which only priests could proceed deeper into that next room. In this next room that I'm discussing right now, there was an altar of incense, there was bread, and there was a menorah. Now, in the very back, in the section behind this, there was another separate sanctum that was reserved for the high priest and the high priest alone. And it was reserved for the high priest to enter once a year during their most holy of holy days, the Day of Atonement, aka Yom Kippur. Now, this section of the Holy of Holies was a space that housed the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was this wooden box that was covered in gold. It was topped with a lid that was known as the mercy seat. And on the mercy seat, on this lid, there was 2 flanking engraved mythical creatures known as cherubim on either side of the ark. You have actually seen an inaccurate depiction of this ark in Indiana Jones. Now, contrary to popular belief, cherubim were not winged people. They weren't angels for the ancient Israelites, but rather they were winged lions, kind of like sphinxes. And this mercy seat adorning the top of the Ark of the Covenant was meant to artistically represent a throne. Now, the ark beneath the lid, beneath that mercy seat, depicts where a monarch's footstool would be. It's symbolic of where the monarch would rest the monarch's feet at the base of the throne. But what's interesting here is that God is not depicted as sitting on this symbolic throne. Now, why is that? Because unlike other Near Eastern religions, there were no graven images of God located in the Israelite sanctum, because God was believed to be present inside the Holy of Holies in the form of a sapient cloud. And for these ancient sages, this cloud that embodied God's presence sanctified the space, this Holy of Holies. So in their mind, sanctification was the process of God making a person, a place, or a thing holy. So God was making something holy. Now, the metaphor behind the tabernacle's architecture of these 3 different stages that you would go through as you progress through the space was to symbolize the ancient Israelites' idea that a person's individual holiness increases as proximity to God also increases. So as they moved toward God's presence, which resided in the Holy of Holies, holiness would increase as they moved through the space. Now, this is where the study just blew my mind, y'all, because it is diametrically opposed to everything that evangelicals taught me about Leviticus. Pro tip, theology nerds, by the way, learn from my mistakes, okay? Please learn from my mistakes. If you want to learn about the Hebrew Bible, approach a Jewish scholar or a rabbi first. not a Christian, not a Christian pastor at all, which is why I highly recommend Professor Hayes' online Yale course, because she is a brilliant Jewish scholar and she knows her stuff. As a Christian, the Protestant concept of what we assume holiness means in the Hebrew Bible is vastly different from what ancient Israelites thought that holiness meant. First off, we tend to understand biblical purity and biblical holiness to be this synonymous descriptor. So for us, holiness and purity are kind of the same thing. But in fact, for ancient Israelites, these are mutually exclusive spiritual characteristics. They're not the same, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. Now, also in the mind of these ancients, only God could be intrinsically and completely holy. That was reserved strictly for God. Now, the term holy in its original context does not mean like spiritual perfection, right? It means separate. It means set apart. Now, God can sanctify or make things separate or set things apart, make people, places, and things holy once they have been designated and dedicated for God's exclusive use. And that is a prerequisite for God making something holy. It has to be dedicated for God's exclusive use. And again, only God can impart holiness in the process that they called sanctification. And in the minds of the ancient Israelites, people, places, or things were either holy or they were profane, according to the text in Leviticus. But something that was really interesting to me is that Professor Hayes points out that this is a mistranslation, this word profane. And in a more appropriate translation would be the term common. So things were either holy, they were set apart, they were separate, or they were common. No in between, okay? No gray areas. Things were holy or they were profane, meaning they were common. But just because something was common or profane did not mean that it was evil in their minds, which is what a lot of evangelicals teach. For them, profane, common just means that the natural state of the item or individual in question is neutrality. Take this hat, for example, all right? It is common, it's profane, according to the ancient Israelites, especially for every white guy in his 30s adorned with a beard and a mustache like mine that enjoys craft beer, pipe tobacco, and smoked meats, all right? It's not all that unique. As wonderfully unique as I think I am, it's not all that different. The kids today might call my hipster attire basic, all right? But if I told you that this common, this profane hipster hat, this flat cap once belonged to Anthony Hopkins or to Ryan Reynolds, well, this everyday hat, this profane hat, just got a lot more significant, didn't it? So for ancient Israelites, things, places, and people are just common or ordinary on their own, which is neither good nor evil, unless they belong to God, in which case God sanctifies them and they become set apart as something revered, as something special, thus implying that they are separate from that which is considered to be everyday items, that which is considered to be common. Now, this process of separation, sanctification, was achieved by following rules and rituals that kept people, places, and things holy. And to achieve the preservation of holiness, or to ascend to the status of holiness, meant that those traditions, those laws, and those rituals had to be honored. Now, this is also interesting because holiness was also incremental in regards to measuring time. Just like holiness was understood in incremental degrees, the further you would go into the tabernacle, the further you would go, the more holy things became. So was the ancient Israelite calendar incrementally more holy. Like, let me explain. You had common days, and then you had the Sabbath, which was their weekly day of worship and reverence. And then you had holy days, which is where we get the modern term holiday, right? The holy day, the holiday. And finally, for ancient Israelites, there was the holiest of days, which was Yom Kippur, which was literally their Sabbath of Sabbaths, right? On this day, the most holy person in their community, the high priest, would go into the most holy location in the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, that innermost sanctum, and the high priest would perform a ritual on the most holy of artifacts, the Ark of the Covenant. Now, that is how ancient Israelites understood holiness, that it was something that was set apart, something that was not ordinary. But what was their view of purity? Because remember, I said they're not the same. We often view holiness and purity as the same thing in the Christian tradition. Purity, again, was not synonymous with holiness, but rather biblical purity was the prerequisite for a person, for a place, for a thing to become holy or set apart by God. So in order for something to be sanctified, to be set apart, to be made holy, and achieve that status of holiness, the thing or being in question had to become pure. So purity was a qualification. It was not the status of holiness. It was the qualification to become holy. Impurity, by definition, would be a disqualifier for something to become holy, for something to become sanctified. So purification was the process in which they removed impurity. Now, this next thing blew my mind, y'all. When I say it blew my mind, I mean, I think Allie heard me go, oh my God, that's amazing, when I was reviewing this from the other room. For ancient Israelites, profane things, or common things, again, could be pure or they could be impure. It really just depended on the object in question. Again, for them, profane things could be pure or they might be impure. But for them, if something was to be holy, it must be pure. And the moment holiness comes in contact with impurity, the moment something that is holy comes in contact with something that is impure, it immediately becomes impure, just like that. Like the moment that ketchup touches a steak, or the moment that pineapple touches pizza, or that pickles touch a cheeseburger, or that Rian Johnson touches Star Wars dialogue, or that HBO touches Game of Thrones. Like the moment that happens, that once sacred thing has immediately become impure. I'm just kidding, by the way, y'all, I'm just messing around. I think there's more people upset about the pineapple on pizza than there was about the Star Wars thing. That's wild. I've got some hardcore fans. But anyway, once something is no longer holy in their mind, it has to have all of those impurities removed, and it has to be re-sanctified by God through a ritual or through atonement. Now, in regards to the tabernacle, in regards to priest and high priest, they actually had different requirements for purity based on how high of their status was in the sanctum. So priest had different qualifications than the high priest had for holiness and achieving holiness, meaning that increased access to holiness in the tabernacle required increased levels of purity. Priest had the highest authority, and the high priest had the highest of highest authorities in their community. And the ethical standard to obtain priesthood was raised the higher you climbed their societal structure. So, by comparison, in American government, our standard of ethics, I think this day and age, are just lowered the higher you climb in politics, or at least it seems that way. Like, relax, y'all. It's just a joke. Or is it? Yeah, this is the presidency. This is where America would reserve our seat for our most ethical people, if we had any. I'm just kidding. Now, according to Professor Hayes, purity in the Hebrew Bible can be divided up into two categories. You have ritual purity and you have moral purity. And they were two separate things in regards to purity laws. Ritual purity does not have any connection to the notion of sinful behavior. In fact, sometimes things that were considered to be ritually impure were required and even instructed in the Bible. For example, the Hebrew Bible tells us that sexual intercourse makes one ritually impure for a time. But the Hebrew Bible also commands humans to be fruitful and to multiply. Now, here's another example. Burying the dead is biblically required, but also, according to Levitical law, contact with dead flesh makes one ritually impure. So sometimes just doing things that are instructed in the Bible made someone ritually impure for a time. So those acts, though impure, they're common acts, thus they are not sinful according to the Hebrew Bible, but they are impure. I know that's a little strange. One characteristic of ritual impurity also is that it's contagious. It's like a virus. You can actually become pure by coming in contact with someone or something that you can become impure by coming in contact with someone or something that is also impure, even if you're under the same roof. Right? So touching and sharing space with an impure person or object could contaminate you as well, but it could be remedied easily enough if you followed certain incantations or rituals, or even if you just waited a certain amount of time, the impurity might just wear off, depending on what we're talking about. Now, many evangelical scholars taught me, and still teach, that purity laws were due to logical hygiene practices that made sense in the ancient world, and that's why they came about. That's why they had the diets that they had. They didn't eat things that were more prone to bacteria and parasites and things like that. But that's actually not accurate. Yes, it is probably not a good idea to eat shrimp in an ancient world without antibiotics and refrigeration. But ancient Israelites also sprinkled animal blood all over their sanctuary as well. And as we have learned in this pandemic, animal blood carries diseases. Just ask the pangolins or the bats or both, because that was the source of this outbreak, was animal blood. And Jewish ritual required animal blood to be sprinkled in the sanctuary. Also, human and animal feces in ancient Israelite culture was not considered to be ritually impure in the Hebrew Bible. And if hygiene was the reasoning for Levitical laws, then apparently no one told these ancient Israelites that poop is hella germy. In my opinion, the process of ritual purity likely didn't originate from hygiene, but probably from Canaanite pagan exorcism practices that had a shift in meaning for the Israelites. But in truth, and according to Professor Hayes, we can't really know the origins of these practices, but what is most important, what we can know, is the relationship that purity has, and especially impurity has, to holiness, and the antithetical relationship that holiness and purity have with one another, because they are at odds with each other. Now, there are three sources of ritual impurity in the Hebrew Bible. One is coming into contact with a dead person or a dead animal. Dead flesh is impure. The second is diseased or dying flesh. And the Hebrew Bible calls this leprosy in English, and it's the original word for it is sara'et in Hebrew. And it does not mean leprosy, but rather it was probably a skin disease like psoriasis, which oddly enough, I actually have. So I got bad news for you, church. Your pastor was born ritually impure, which is why I can drink when I teach and curse when I preach. Damn it. And finally, the last source of impurity was sexual and genital discharges. I told you it's a PG-13 service. You can't get mad. It's in the Bible. I'm teaching you the Bible. But I want you to notice a theme with the three sources of ritual impurity. I want you to notice a theme with those. Any substance associated with the decay and the creation of human life caused ritual impurity. So not only was death ritually impure, but procreation and anything associated with that process was ritually impure. Why is that? Because ritual purity practices for the priestly authors of Leviticus was centered around the concept of imitating God. This deity, according to the Hebrew Bible, is both immortal, so beyond death, and asexual, incapable of reproduction. So God can't die, God can't impregnate, and God can't become pregnant. That's right. God's pronouns, y'all, are they, them. You heard it right here today. This means that for ancient Israelites to purify and prepare something for entering into the realm of that which is holy, a realm that is separate from both death and procreation, one must separate from the physical manifestations of death and procreation if they wish to imitate that being and enter into a more holy space of the sanctuary. Now, to be clear, to be crystal clear, this does not mean that we should not bury our dead. This does not mean that people with psoriasis are impure. It does not mean that we should not have sex, because the Bible makes it clear that we are supposed to, and it says that multiple times. These practices are not sinful. What the Hebrew Bible explains is that the ancient Israelites believed that they must go through a purification ritual before they entered into a space to imitate their God that in their mind is simultaneously immortal and asexual. Now, oddly enough, ritual impurity, though disassociated with death, incorporated animal sacrifice into their process of accomplishing purity. And at first glance, that seems totally hypocritical. Like, if you're trying to remove the influence of death from the presence of God, why would you slaughter an animal in the sanctuary? Now, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a veterinarian, but I'm pretty sure that when you sacrifice an animal, it usually leads to death. I don't know, I was educated in the South. And know this, I'm not condoning sacrifices, church. I'm not saying that we should bring this practice back. But I do have to explain the mindset of the ancient Israelites, and they did practice animal sacrifices. Remember that ancient Israelites practiced these sacrifices because in their mind, achieving and maintaining holiness required them to imitate God. Now this is where things get really interesting. Ancient Israelites believed that the power of life and death over humans belonged to God. God is often described as a loving shepherd, and we as humans are often described as God's beloved flock. Thus, Israelites believed that through sacrifice they were imitating that control over the life and death of their livestock because God had control over us, God's sheep. God controlled when we were born, and when we died, they believed that by sacrificing an animal in the sanctuary, they were displaying their control over their livestock because they're trying to imitate God. And again, it seems like this is kind of some type of pacified, controlled savagery at first glance, but note that this was almost always done to animals that the community was going to consume in a meal, like saying grace before your chicken dinner. So in many ways, the Israelites revered their livestock more than we have a positive presence in the realm of farming in the modern world. Like, Western culture has zero regard for the animals that we harvest for our food, and even the animals that we kill while we're harvesting our food. I mean, the amount of animals that we kill when we're fishing is unreal. So in many ways, they respected animal life far more than we do today. Also note this, folks, and this is important. Tribal cultures lived in harmony with nature for centuries and didn't disrupt the ecosystem. And many tribes still do. It's Western culture that's the problem. Western culture seeks to dominate nature with very little reverence for life, and there lies one of humanity's greatest sins. But back to Leviticus. Let's take a drink first. Now, not only was sacrifice used as a form of imitating God, but it was also believed that the process of imitating God and the process of animal sacrifice could attract and appease God. And there were three types of sacrifices that the ancient Israelites did. There were grain offerings, which were grains mixed with incense and oil, and they were burned at the altar to create a nice aroma that was a pleasing gift to God. And then there were burnt offerings, which was when the entirety of an animal or a piece of meat was burned twice a day. And some scholars actually believe that this was actually an ancient method of slowly smoking the meats that the priest would eat during the day. And I actually am pretty sure that this art of slow roasting meats was perfected and honed and handed down for generations until it got to Southerners, where we do it, pretty much perfectly today. I'm kidding again. But I am from South Carolina, and if you've ever had my pork shoulder, I would argue that it could attract God. Back to the story. Then you have the peace offerings. All right, and peace offerings were sacrifices that were brought to the temple, and then they went through this ritual, and they would take these sacrifices home to their families to celebrate or to mark a completion of a deed or a covenant. So these were celebratory meals. And this is where today's message is critical, right? These tribal rituals were done, and they were repeated because Israelites believed that these acts could attract and appease the presence of an all-loving God, an all-just God, that they justifiably wanted to remain in their midst, because this God was all good and this God was just. Because just as the God could be appeased in their minds and remain with them through sacrifice, this God could also just as easily become displeased and flee from their presence. And how could that happen for them? What would cause God to flee? Actions of grave sin would cause God to leave their presence. Heinous crime would cause God to leave their community. That would repel this God of love and justice from their midst. And the three most horrific sins to the Israelite God was idolatry of another god or a monarch, especially a ruler who had a character counter to God's loving attributes. So take note, Trump supporters. Also, homicide was another grave sin, the taking of another human life that was made in the image of God. And finally, rape. The sexual sins that are often understood by evangelical culture in Leviticus. They often depict these sexual sins as homosexuality or different sexual identities. And actually, these sexual sins in Leviticus are concerned with the Israelites never stooping to raping innocent people. The Bible actually never condemned, or raping anyone. The Bible actually never condemns any one sexual identity at all, but it does condemn the practice of rape. So these three types of moral impurities, as opposed to ritual impurity, not only defile the offender, but also the sanctuary where God dwelled, and possibly the entire nation of Israel was defiled because of these sins if they went unchecked. Now, here are some other distinctions of moral impurity as opposed to ritual impurity. Moral impurity could be avoided only through abstinence, and transgressions could not be removed through acts of ritual and through the passing of time. So the negative impact of moral impurity would dissolve holiness through moral crimes, and it could only be resolved by communal punishment, or preferably by repentance and atonement by the perpetrator as an act of apology to the divine for that crime. So after these heinous crimes were committed in the mind of the ancient Israelite, both their land and their sanctuary and the tabernacle would become defiled if anyone in their community committed a crime against humanity. Now, fortunately, the sanctuary, the tabernacle, could be cleansed of these impurities because of moral impurity. And they would do this with the blood of their sacrificial animal meat that they would bring to the temple. And this is also an interesting fact. For ancient Israelites, blood was symbolic of life, not death. And in their mind, blood of animals that they ate was reserved for God and for these atonement rituals because God was the ultimate depiction of eternal life. And again, blood was symbolic of life. And blood was symbolic of life given to this God of life, and that would appease God because life was given to the source of life. So the blood of their meat was extracted and reserved exclusively for atonement ritual, and it was sprinkled on their altars and as an act of atonement at the annual holiest of holy days, Yom Kippur. They would take, before they sprinkled the blood on the altar, they would actually take their sacrificial animal, and they would also take a goat, and they would symbolically place all of the sins of the community onto the goat, and they would set the goat free, which is where we get the term scapegoat. And then they would take the blood of the sacrificial meat and sprinkle it on the altar of the Holy of Holies. So their sanctuary could be cleansed of crime in the community at Yom Kippur, but their land, their nation, could not. They believed that only repentance or punishment could remove that curse from their land. And in fact, they felt that if enough crimes were committed against humanity, that God would eventually remove God's protection, that God would eventually move God's favor and God's blessing from that nation. And this is significant because unlike surrounding ancient Near Eastern cultures, they did not blame moral impurity on demonic influence. They didn't blame the devil for the crimes committed by their citizens. Ancient Israelites placed that responsibility of criminal behavior on the individual, not on a demonic spirit. They placed the burden of demanding repentance and atonement on the community and not on God. God didn't atone for the sins of the people for them, and the devil didn't cause that person to commit a crime. The devil didn't make you do it, and God wasn't going to clean up after it. That was solely on the shoulders of the Israelites, and there is a lesson for us in that knowledge today, church, because this practice of maintaining purity and cultivating goodness lies in our hands, and we are responsible for the crimes that manifest in society. And if we allow crime and corruption to continue unchecked, then eventually society is gonna fall apart. And as someone who has a job that is supposed to speak to the conscience of the entirety of our society, to both sides of the political aisle, accountability is an equal opportunity employer. And it is a bipartisan requirement if we want to save America from fading out of existence, if we want to save America from crumbling and deteriorating into chaos. Now, at this point, I have to do something that is difficult for me to do because I know that it's going to cost me some fans right now. Sorry, not sorry. I've got to do my job. I have said from the beginning of this church's formation that we were never going to try to build a big church. We were not going to try to create a church that would become known for how many people it can attract. We were not trying to make a a building that was an attraction. We were trying to build a movement that was attractive. So we're not trying to become the next Six Flags Over Jesus. That's just not us. Here at Greater Purpose, we are trying to build a community where people of all identities are safe, where they are affirmed and they are welcome. And we are trying to build a church where we speak truth, unapologetic truth to power, difficult truth, prickly truth, but blessed truth. And sometimes that means that we have to hold our own political side of the aisle accountable. Sometimes it means that our leaders need to have their feet held to the fire. And y'all, what's sad for me is it's rarely popular to do that. It's rarely popular to hold your team to account. And on top of that, as a church planner, it rarely results in exponential church growth when you practice this. But it's necessary, because church, as a minister, I must speak conviction. And at times I am required to choose between saying what is right over what is institutionally comfortable. But I need you to know that this is me venting my own conscience right now. And you're free to do with it whatever you want. You're free to disagree even. And I'm still available to wrestle my position with you if you don't agree. The Bible says, as iron sharpens iron, so does one person sharpen another. But please, I am asking you, you all know me, at least listen, at least consider what I'm about to say to you. And if you don't agree, I still love you. I still think we can continue to have a relationship together, and I hope you still love me too, and that you feel the same way. Speaking of Me Too, some time ago, we dedicated a worship service to Dr. Ford, a brave woman that dared to confront Brett Kavanaugh. And though this was probably extremely difficult for Dr. Ford, we chose against some people in our church's opinions. We chose to honor her bravery, and we chose to recognize her resolve and expose the truth of what was going on with Brett Kavanaugh. And we weren't alone. And that was really encouraging for me. The Democratic Party was quick to defend Dr. Ford and really fight for her voice to be heard, as the Republicans thwarted left and right any real possibility of a fair trial. And I still honor Dr. Ford, and I told you we were going to do this a few times, I lift my glass to Dr. Ford. And sadly, our battle against the shameful appointment of Brett Kavanaugh was a campaign that would inevitably be defeated. But Dr. Ford's bravery helped to galvanize the Me Too movement and fueled a cultural dialogue that will continue to fight for injustice in regards to sexism and in regards to toxic misogyny in politics. And that fight has led us to this crossroads, this major complication, and the fires of this present conflict now illuminate and surround another victim. But this time, the victim is a person that is opposed to someone on our side of the aisle. Every day, there is more and more evidence coming to light that Joe Biden possibly, keyword possibly, sexually assaulted Tara Reade. And we're not talking about an affair. We're not talking about private or public acts of indiscretion. We are talking about sexual assault. Y'all, if you got kids, send them away for a minute, because I need you to know the depth of poor morals that we're talking about here. According to Tara Reade, in the 90s, Joe Biden held her up against the wall and, against her vocalized consent, took his hand and penetrated her. And she is being ran through the ringer like she is some type of villain, like she is some type of criminal right now. And Joe Biden has denied this, and he has yet to apologize. Now, before I go any further, you all know, and I tell you this all the time, there was a point in my life, in my past, where I was a sexist, racist, abusive, bigoted piece of shit in my evangelical days. I don't run from that. I own it. It disgusts me, but that's who I was. And one of the things that I often hear when I hold politicians on the left to a higher standard is this. I hear people that I have told that I have a past that I'm not proud of, they always bring this up. They say, Christopher, you're not perfect. You have a past too. And they're not wrong. I do have a past, one that I am far from proud of. But there are two differences here between my past and Joe Biden's. One, I admit it, and I'm remorseful as I own my atrocious past. There's repentance there. I still wrestle with my former toxic traits when they bubble up on a daily basis. I'm opposed to the system that created me publicly, and I constantly fight against people that look just like my former self. I mean, I've already told Allie, if evangelical Christopher ever resurrects, if I ever reappear to end it quickly, make it look like a misdiagnosis, make it look like an accident. And she's a nurse, so I'm pretty sure she can make it happen. In fact, she said she would, and she laughed for a while she said it, and she kept laughing, and that kind of made me uncomfortable, but I digress. The point is, Biden has yet to apologize for this claim or for how he treated Anita Hill. So, an attempt to repent can be visible in my career, though I'm still far from perfect. But sadly, we can't say that about Biden. Now, the second difference between Joe and I is that I'm not applying to rule the nation. I mean, today we talked about how in the Israelite culture, how the higher someone climbed in their nation's positions of influence, the higher the standard of ethical purity became. Now, I agree, y'all. I'm not fit to be your president, okay? Even now, after years of work, after some therapy, I'm not qualified. So, church, let me be clear. Never vote for me to be your president, or at least not in the immediate future. It's going to end badly for everyone. I'm not qualified. I don't have the strength of character. I don't have the experience necessary to do that job justice. And based on these latest allegations, y'all, I gotta say, Joe Biden may is the key word, he may not have the strength of character necessary to lead this nation either. Maybe he does. We can't say for sure. Which is why we should believe this brave woman for coming forward and at least investigate Biden the way we fought to investigate Brett Kavanaugh, because there is enough evidence to possibly verify Reed's story, and if there's not, it will clear Biden's name. I mean, but I tend to think there is something to these allegations, y'all. In some ways, Tara Reid has more evidence than Dr. Ford had. I mean, there's a tape from Larry King Live where Reed's mother called in during this special episode in the 90s, shortly after this assault happened, and she asked for anonymous advice from Larry King about her daughter that was assaulted by a politician. She didn't go into a ton of details, and she she kept her name under wraps, but they were able to trace that phone call back to her neighborhood. So they know that she called in the 90s about this. There are a total of 5 people that are confirming that Tara Reade's story is accurate. And one of those people was her neighbor, and she happens to be a vocal Biden supporter. So this is a Biden supporter saying, yes, I am voting for Joe Biden, but also this did happen. She came to my house and cried about it the next day, and I told her to go to the police, and she refused at the time because she didn't think anything was gonna come from it. This is already substantially more than Dr. Ford had against Kavanaugh, and we all know that Brett Kavanaugh was guilty as hell. And where once the Democratic Party was on the front row of the right side of history, saying "Me Too" and "Time is up" and chanting "Me Too, time is up," we now see Democratic leadership standing firmly opposed to Tara Reade's story, saying, "No, not him," or "maybe next time." I still don't see how, at this point, with the information that's come forward, how can we claim to be Me Too feminist and simultaneously be vocal Biden apologist in the same breath? It is blatant hypocrisy. It is clearly a double standard. And if Biden is innocent, if the charges are false, then a thorough investigation televised before a Senate committee with full access to the files that Biden refuses to unseal will expose the truth. It will benefit him. That's what we demanded of Brett. Why aren't we doing the same for Biden? Y'all, it's not up to me to decide if Biden is guilty. But if he is, he must express some sort of atonement. He must own up to these heinous acts. Y'all, as a leftist, the number of prominent leaders that have tarnished the progress that the Me Too movement made nationally, for me this past week, has been gut-wrenching. It's been heartbreaking, y'all. And though Reade is not getting the same positive recognition by folks on the left that Ford did, let me say publicly, Tara Reade, you are my hero. You are a hero. I lift my glass one final time to you. I honor your courage. And even if the political storm coming your way, Tara Reade, to demolish you, even if it has a blue wave in its wake this time instead of a red one, I choose to stand by you. This is not about right versus left, church. This is about right versus wrong. This is about upholding the ethical standards that we demand from conservatives. So who should you vote for in November? Should you or should you not vote for Biden? That is not for me to decide for you, church. You have to vote your conscience. But in the meantime, between now and November, the one thing I can say is that biblically, God's people must always stand for the victimized, for the silenced, and for the downtrodden. That is non-negotiable. So until an actual full investigation is conducted on the person seeking the highest seat of office in the land, I stand with her. I stand with Tara Reade. And if we do not stand with the marginalized, if we do not take corrupt rulers of government to task, then our nation's corruption will one day catch up to us. The damage to our land because of their moral impurity will one day eventually cause irreparable harm. Society will eventually crumble, and we will all deserve that tragic fate if we do nothing, because our hypocrisy and our indifference will be solely responsible for our collective demise. If you got that green product, if you have your wine, now is the time. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. And he said, "This is my body. It's broken for you. Take and eat, and as often as you do so in remembrance of me." Likewise, he took a cup. He said, "This is my blood. It's going to be poured out for you. It's the blood of a new covenant. Take and drink, and as often as you do so in remembrance of me." The thing that popped in my mind this week while I was preparing for communion was that part of the Last Supper, or at least the symbolism behind the first communion, was passing on a legacy of political and societal accountability that can be messy and difficult at times. When you hold people accountable, if they're your opposition, it's one thing. If you're holding your own team accountable, that's something else entirely. And what I remember about the story of Jesus is not only did he take the corrupt empire of Rome to task, which ultimately landed him on the cross, Jesus also took the leadership of the temple to task. Jesus was Jewish. Jesus was challenging unjust policies that made its way into the temple. And in many ways, Jesus was keeping his own team accountable. He was holding his own side to account. And that legacy of not accepting hypocrisy is, in my mind, meant to be passed on to the church. And it's something I challenge you to do as well, church. I'm not telling you who to vote for. I'm not telling you that Biden is any better or worse than Trump. What I'm telling you is that this situation is no better and no worse than it was with Brett Kavanaugh. And Tara Reade deserves the same amount of respect that was given to Dr. Ford. And that these allegations need to be taken seriously. And if we can't do that, then we are blatant hypocrites. And the world's going to see right through us. And the movement deserves better than hypocrisy. And until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wasteland and protect you through the storm. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you, and may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. I apologize if my voice was a little bit shaky today. I'm dealing with all of these allergies. I'm trying not to cough up a lung in the middle of the sermon. But I love y'all. Enjoy the music, enjoy the poetry, enjoy the dancing. We'll see you next week. Love y'all.